Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us at this webinar today. We've got a really exciting group of people that are going to speak to you, essentially talking about the understanding the science of violence, and if violence is transmitted like a disease, how do we cure it? Very shortly, I'm going to hand you over to my colleague Lib Peck, who is, I'm sure many of you know, the director of the Violence Reduction Unit. And then hopefully, assuming he hasn't been called away, I'm going to hand you over to Duncan Bew. Duncan is one of London's leading trauma surgeons. I'm sure, like everybody else in the country, people are overwhelmed at what our colleagues in the NHS are doing for us at the moment. So the fact that Duncan has given up some time to come and talk to us, I'm really honoured about that. Can I just add that you will see that Duncan's in his scrubs because he's currently on call. So I'm hoping by the time we get to his slot, somebody hasn't been brought into the hospital and he hasn't left us. But I'm hopeful that you will have the opportunity to hear from Duncan, and then he will be able to join us a little bit later on the panel. But if he disappears, I'd like to thank him for attempting to join us at what is, I know, a very difficult time for him and every other colleague working in the NHS. I'm really excited to be able to bring colleagues from Cure Violence to this webinar, and I'm sure many of you will be really excited to hear from them. I was just saying that the work of Cure Violence came to my attention a couple of years ago, just as I'd taken over at Safer London, and I was lucky enough to have breakfast with Charlie Ransford, who is their Director of Science and Policy. And Charlie just blew me away with the evidence of just what an impact the work at Cure Violence has, both in the States and where they've rolled it out. And I'm sure many of you will know that this is the first of 3 webinars. I'm now going to hand you over to Lib and Duncan to begin to talk about London, but I'm sure and I'm hopeful that many of you will join us for the further webinars that you can register for on our website over the coming days. So I'm hopeful that the tech works and that everything will hand over nicely, but I'm going to switch over to Lib. There she is, she's appearing, and I'm going to turn off and be quiet. Thank you, Lib.
Hi, hello, and thank you very much, Sherry, and thanks Safer London, I think, for putting together what looks like an incredibly interesting programme, which I'm really looking forward to hearing. I'm looking forward to hearing it because I think we've talked about doing something like this for quite a long time, but also because I really want to hear the speakers that we've got this afternoon, because I think they're an absolutely great calibre with a huge amount of experience to impart to us. So really looking forward to that. All of that, of course, is meaning really prompting me to be as brief as I can in just talking about the relevance of the London VRU to this agenda. And that's been made even more important by the thought that Duncan Bew, who's been a great advocate of a public health approach and a really committed person of lots of different community organisations on this issue, may be dashed away. So while we've got him, I'm going to try and speak quickly to make sure we get to him. So the immediate relevance, I suppose, of the Violence Reduction Unit in this space is that we've funded a small amount of money for Safer London to explore whether the exciting programme we're going to hear about from Chicago today could be made relevant in a London context. That's the kind of short answer, but obviously the reasons for us supporting this and wanting to explore its relevance is much more really at the core of some of the values and the way that the VRU has been set up to work. And I'm just going to highlight 3 things that I think are of particular importance. So for those of you perhaps less familiar with the London Violence Reduction Unit, we became operational about 18 months ago. We were set up by the Mayor, Sadiq Khan, and we were then replicated in other places via the Home Office and 17 other places across England and Wales. But really the thought behind that was that the system we've got to try and deal with violence wasn't really working. That's not to say individual projects weren't working really hard, but that we needed some kind of shift, and that had to be a longer term shift, looking to the future, developing projects that were much more sustainable, and making sure that to guarantee that sustainability, that communities and young people were very much at the heart of developing solutions. looking to where progress had been made elsewhere. And it was clear that the public health approach, which I'm sure Duncan and others will sort of untangle a bit later on, was something that was really important. Essentially, early prevention, prevention and early intervention were absolutely key to preventing violence. And we looked and learnt from others, and Scotland being the work that they'd done up there being really instrumental in, I think, informing the early days of the Violence Reduction Unit. So at heart, looking elsewhere, learning from other places has been a really important part of the Violence Reduction Unit, not only in London, but across England and Wales. Trying to tease out what works and knowing that the only thing that we have seen that has worked to date is making sure that the sustainability comes through the real support of community and young people's initiatives. So that's the first reason we were really interested in this. And when we come on to the presentations, we'll see that there is a lot of evidence to support it does work. The second thing, I think, is around the approach. Doing a lot of listening, talking, working with community groups has been absolutely part of the London Violence Reduction Unit's kind of DNA over the last 18 months. And what we've very much heard is that the personal relationships are the transformational relationships. How you support parents, how you support teachers, how you support youth practitioners, and how fundamentally you support young people by listening to what they want, articulating the opportunities for them and their ambitions is really, really key. But alongside that support around individuals has to be a sense of context and a sense of place. And so a lot of our other programs that we've either funded or worked with other groups have been around place, looking across London, either at a borough level or actually much more meaningfully at a neighbourhood level. And so that combination of place and people, which seems to be very well reflected in the programme we're going to hear about today, is a kind of secondary reason. And the third for us is that we try to use our pan-London position to, yes, advocate for policy change, and certainly to develop public sector partnerships and community partnerships wherever we can. But we also we do have a small amount of resources to invest. We're never going to be big funders, but we do take, obviously, the significance of our investment, as a really important way of levering in the kind of ethos we think is really important in trying to change what's going on, trying to change the culture. And so we funded things where we think there's a gap. We funded things where we've tried to consolidate organisations working together, and our latest programme is really about asking networks of organisations in neighbourhoods to come together so that we can use that funding to strengthen the network and help the network to grow. And the third kind of reason for us in terms of funding is innovation. And I think this is innovative as a programme, and so therefore we're really keen to explore and see, to what extent it has resonance in a London context. Before I finish up and hand over to Duncan, I think there are two really important things that we do need to test. The first is context. I talked about the people and the place, and the context is really important. I don't think you can just get a model from elsewhere and then translate it into a London scene. Everything we know about how we tackle violence has to come from a neighbourhood, from the ground up, and then be sort of enabled, supported, and invested in by sort of pan-London bodies such as the London VRU. So how we do that join is really important for me. And secondly, I have to put my hand up now and say that much of the language around the public health approach I feel uncomfortable with. The approach itself I like, but the language around curing and the language around disease is not something that sits easily with me. In the same way, I always find it difficult when people are being talked about as if they've overcome their battle with cancer, in a way as if people who don't somehow overcome their battle are inherently more feeble or weaker. So there's something about the language that I would also want to interrogate, but I think it's a fantastic opportunity for us to really listen, learn, and hopefully provoke some really interesting thoughts about the work we're already engaged in and maybe the work that we want to undertake further. So with that, I'll hand over to Duncan and look forward to listening to the rest of our speakers. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Liv. It's fantastic. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. So I'm just going to try and switch screens. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. So I'm just going to talk for the next 10 minutes about violence as a public health issue. And this is something that I feel very passionate about. Things I'm going to say are very much my own opinion, not that of my employer. I'm the trauma surgeon here at King's, and I also co-founded the charity Growing Against Violence. And I've been involved in several efforts with the Mayor's Office and many of the collaborations like the Parliamentary Youth Violence Commission, the APPG, and several other ventures collaboratively in London to try and really move these issues forwards, as well as some personal experience of the Cure the Violence project in Cape Town, which I'm a huge fan of. So I'm going to talk around just the issues as I see them and just challenge a few of the concepts as we go through. So we've seen a significant improvement in survival from major trauma since we reorganised networks of care. And I think the idea of networks of care and systems rather than just individual units is really key to success across all populations. And this has shown almost a 20% improvement in survival since the trauma networks were put in place. But of course, there was a huge inequality of access to trauma care 10 years ago, which has now been largely corrected, but there are still issues that we need to address. But one of the things that I always find slightly challenging is the concept that our marker of success is just mortality. And I think we should move away from the idea of the number of deaths and mortality as being a marker of success. We need to think about those who've suffered and continue to suffer from not just physical aspects of trauma, but also the deep psychological aspects of trauma, be it that's led to the trauma in the first place or as a consequence of it. And this is something that's really important. It's really important in terms of the way we think about the whole system of care, right from the point of injury all the way through to rehabilitation, not just for the individuals and getting them back to their lives with their families and the life that they want to have, the maximum potential, but also as a society in terms of paying taxes, GDP, and what that really means to our overall society. And to that degree, our health is the true wealth of our country. And this is particularly the case for low to middle income countries, where this is a really substantial part of the workforce, the young age group, and makes a massive difference if you can really get this right. And the works of the Lancet Commission and others have really shown this, that if you can put $1 in, you get $7 back. And for in terms of healthcare like this, for major trauma care, you get about $300 back. So this is really big effort and a big response and big return on the investment if you can really see it. But the trouble is that the benefits seem to be in silos from all over the place, from education, from health, from the judiciary and other centres of funding. So it's difficult to pull us together in terms of being able to have a tangible return on that unless you see it in that context from above. And one thing really important is just to understand our statutory services aren't all provided by our country and by the NHS system. And actually, just like with the provision of care for prevention, actually our system is bookended by charities. Many people don't realise that the air ambulances are helidecs and helipads, and much of our rehabilitation infrastructure is in fact charitable. I think it's really important to recognise that and the really valuable work that everyone does within those. Now, poverty and inequality clearly underpin a lot of the public health challenges that we see. And the social development goals, I think, are a really good collaborative effort globally to set some benchmarks to try and work towards, because this is truly a global issue. And when you look at those issues of inequality, several really stand out. These are the countries that are top in terms of ability to be able to achieve those goals. And if you just look at that list, this is a bit of a busy slide, but childhood obesity, HIV incidence, suicide mortality, alcohol abuse, non-intimate partner sexual violence, occupational risks, and child sex abuse are all high on the agenda for all of developed countries in terms of us really being challenged in terms of the ability to meet these targets. And that is really significant. And on that alone, I think it's really important that we think about violence and prevention of violence. It's not just from a perspective that we come with our own narrative around knife crime or young people or youth violence and all these kind of terms that have been traditionally used as to define this whole arena, and actually think about the contextual safeguarding within a family, within a community, and what it really means to individuals in the context of their real lives. Now, I think this document, The Contagion of Violence, and all of the work that came from it and that huge collaborative work is really fantastic. And to be able to frame the way in which violence spreads, it forms clusters, the way it's transmitted like this in populations is really useful. Violence behaves like a contagious disease. It behaves like an epidemic. And if you treat violence like an epidemic, it gets results in communities. And these are really key issues. The violence is not inevitable and violence can be prevented. I'm just going to challenge this a little bit. If we interrupt transmission, we can make a huge impact. If we prevent future spread, we know we can make a big difference in reducing violence, but we have to be able to change group norms. And that's not just an attitudinal change, it's long-term work to create a genuine behavioural change. The public health approach, many of you will be familiar with, being able to isolate and identify the problem and then feedback in a loop to be able to really genuinely be able to make a difference. Primary approaches before a violence has occurred, immediate responses after the violence has occurred, with secondary responses, and then tertiary long-term responses. So if we turn these reachable moments within primary, where are these actually occurring? Who is actually delivering these? Are these even targeted? Are they even in the right place? Are we even aware of what the risk is? And the teachable moments that we talk about in secondary care are where a huge amount of funding has gone and a lot of effort. And I can see that's why, because there's a very tangible link between seeing someone who's been injured and shaking their hand, being able to intervene with them. You can see they're clearly being a victim of violence. And that's a very tangible thing to be able to get both funding and support. But who are those teachable moments for? I think we quite often think of teachable moments being for the individual who's been a victim of the violent incident. But actually, I think they're really teachable moments for ourselves and for institutions, because unless we're actually listening, what do we actually know what the threat is? Have we approached this as if it's a knife crime and a knife issue? Is it a violence around just penetrating injuries? When in fact, it could be that actually the main threat to those individuals in that community is actually sexual violence or something else completely different. Unless we have that information, we can't really target the reachable moments within schools, particularly in the transitions, in the silos that people go through in their lives as they transition between different ages and different organizations. How can we actually target that properly? Unless we actually have those teachable moments. And why would you want that intervention to be just a moment? You want really a continuum of what needs to be unconditional support, because those individuals are going back into the same at-risk environment unless you can genuinely get to grips with the safeguarding. And unless you're doing that, what are those teachable moments? Are they really just gaslighting those individuals? And I think the key is really, this has to be culturally credible and it has to have local relevance. These are really themes that go throughout all of this. So structural violence, I think, is a big issue. We have massive issues with social inequality. And it's not just a financial poverty, it's one of opportunity and of aspiration. And we have massive issues with institutional racism. I think Johan Galton's statement here about the dominance and the use of social structure, I think the only people who truly benefit from the inequality of social structure are those who seek to profit from it and to maintain their own monopoly on wealth and privilege. I think that we all have to do something about this. We can't stand in tacit acceptance of this if we really want to get to grips with this problem. So in society that's structurally violent, yes, it may not be inevitable, but is there a level at which it is predictable? Well, yes. But is there a level at which actually violence is inevitable? I'm sure all of us can think of circumstances where we've met somebody in the context of their own lives where violence was inevitable because they were in a very vulnerable situation, in a position where they weren't able to fend for themselves. Do people make the wrong choice or are there no choices? I think too often we think about people as making the wrong choice, but actually they're in a situation where they really have no alternatives. And what if we become trauma-informed, but we're not resourced? What does that mean to us as individuals? If we truly become trauma-informed and change the thresholds at which we'd expect to intervene to someone, either in physical or in terms of mental health support, in terms of their social circumstances, but we don't have the resources to provide it, what degree of burden are we putting on the providers in that conversation if we don't resource what we need to be able to genuinely make a change? And also, if we had all the wealth that we wanted, is peace inevitable? Well, I don't think it is. And peace isn't a passive byproduct of social inclusion. It's something we actually have to work on. And this concept of peace building, I think, is a really important part of violence reduction units and networks. For too long, we've been using the term youth violence. This is youth affected by violence. And of course, there's a huge amount of work that's been done in understanding about adverse life experiences, not just childhood experiences, and just how early you need to be able to intervene to prevent the consequences of exposure to traumatic events. and what that really means to neurodevelopment and actually throughout your whole life. And we know that young people, in particular, who are exposed to events of 5 or 6 adverse childhood experience, that 6th or 7th is most likely to be and at risk of being something which is potentially life-changing or life-threatening. So it's really important we don't define, I think, measures of success or failure in interventions as being whether or not someone's arrested or not and whether or not someone's being killed, because the threshold is just too high. And are we actually all speaking the same language? Do we mean the same thing when we're talking about adolescents and young people and children? These terms are used almost interchangeably, particularly when presenting data, and it's really important that we have the same terms and the same synchronized terms to be able to define these things, not just so that we can genuinely see whether we're making a change with interventions, but also to prevent forming silos to which people fall. The age at which many interventions, particularly in a secondary context, occur with teachable moments, stop at about 25 or 26. But the average age of a young person presenting, for example, at King's with a penetrating injury is 27. For whom is there support in that context? And the WHO defines youth violence between 11 to 30. Who would consider that within the context of what we actually do at the moment? Do we need to challenge the boundaries? And in fact, do we need to have a local relevance of that depending on the community in which we're intervening? So that degree, is it helpful to think about violence as being something that's contagious? As Lib was alluding to, there is something slightly uncomfortable about describing it as a disease, describing it as something that you've caught. The idea that person would then be infectious. And perhaps do we actually then put too much on the individual to think of them as being not resilient enough to have been able to withstand the experience they've gone through. And I think we need to be careful around the terming of that. To that degree, if violence is a consequence of exposure to trauma, is it actually helpful in that context to think of it more as being an industrial disease, exposure to a traumatic event? And this picture is actually a chimney sweep. Chimney sweeps, for those of you who don't know, when we used to send children down chimneys to sweep them, would get exposed to the dust, which would cause them to get scrotal cancer. And this is something that Percival for Pott had noted. Of course, they weren't catching an infection, they weren't infectious, but they had been exposed to a traumatic carcinogen, which had then caused them to develop a cancer. In much in the same way, in structurally violent environments in which young people are growing up, they're exposed to trauma, which then affects them. William Booth in the late 1800s did some tremendous work looking at social deprivation and inequality and its effect. But within it, you see lots of terms that actually are very uncomfortable. The idea that the most socially disadvantaged areas, black, lowest class, vicious, semi-criminal, the sort of the criminalisation of poverty. We repeated this at King's, and we looked at, we've got William Booth House just across the road from us, and looked at the effects of social deprivation and the likelihood of coming in with firearms injuries into our hospital. And actually across the whole of our network, there's a striking association between social deprivation, particularly postcode boundaries, and gunshot wounds, which are clearly probably one of the most serious forms of violence that we see. And rather unusually, in the UK as opposed to the States, because levels of gun ownership are so different, the majority within urban areas of firearms injuries are associated with serious violence related to the drug trade and gang activity. Whereas if you go into rural areas, with farmers with shotguns and other people for sporting purposes, you're much more likely to have other forms of injury. Now in the States, 70% of the firearms injuries are actually, that cause homicides, are actually suicides. And that's more of the kind of pattern that you see in rural areas in the UK. Within the context of London, less than 5% of suicides. And this association between deprivation quintiles and the chance of being shot. And of course, within that, within the environment, there are many things that are statistically significant in the locality where I'm working. Index of income, employment, education, skills and training, barriers to housing and services, and deprivation affecting old people, all being statistically significant. And I think it's really important that we see this context of that exposure to trauma in the context of the real lives of the individuals that we see, and in terms of the experiences they have, but also that structurally violent environment. What are we doing about that actual environment that they're in, as well as the aspects that we can consider as a contagion? It's really important that we see these things in the whole context if we're really going to make a deep-rooted change. Otherwise, what we're doing is focusing on the resilience of the individuals, so that socioeconomic stress and the violent environment, rather than actually changing the environment they're in that's actually causing the trauma in the first place. Within the context of this, We have this huge focus on knives, this huge focus on young people being the cause of a problem, and this stereotyping of what's considered to be threat. And we all know what a tremendous impact this has had on young people from a negative aspect. Many of the youth service surveys that have been done and the voice of young people is really crucial in how we move forwards from this, not just in terms of how the voyeuristic way in which organisations, sportswear manufacturers, the media, and all kinds of people can capitalise on this, but the way in which the media repeatedly uses weapons, and the context of the difficult questions around whether the police should be using images of knives in showing some of the great work that the police are doing. Is that something that's appropriate? And that's a really interesting question that we know is being studied at the moment. But this context around knives being the problem, young people like this, I think we need to challenge these. We did an evaluation of the pediatric trauma in London, and actually 60% of the injuries that we see are blunt injuries. 1 in 3 of the young people live in poverty, 1 in 4 have safeguarding issues, 1 in 10 have no permanent home, significant issues with poor mental health and these adverse childhood experiences. And repeatedly the same things keep cropping up: safe spaces, safe journeys, and the lack of a trusted adult in the lives of young people. The majority of injuries actually happen in someone's home. And I think this is something that we've seen as a challenge during the lockdown, that when people have been in their own home, their home isn't actually a safe place. It's quite often a misconception that people are out on the street because they're up to no good, but sometimes people are out on the street because actually it's actually safer than being at home. And are they making safe journeys? This data from King's is actually from 10 years ago, showing the association of the closure of school times and then into the evening, the likelihood of stabbings presenting as a trauma. And this is being backed up in recent evidence from East London as well. We still have the same problem. And this exploitation of young people along county lines of economic trade around the drug trade, taking drugs out to the coastal towns, going up Cunch. And we see this time and time again. And inextricably linked with that, other forms of violence, sexual violence. And this needs to be seen in the same context. It's just as serious and just as much of a concern as a penetrating injury. And it's not right that it's wrong, but we've got used to it, as unfortunately those who are exploited have as well. And the county lines actually mirror the trauma networks. I talked about the importance of trauma networks and networks of care and networks of prevention. These are really key across whole communities. And I think that we need to understand that these are economic lines of trade also for criminal enterprise that seek to exploit young people. And in the context of that, I think it's just really important that we challenge the way in which we provide prevention, where we think about our prevention services. Feudal unequal relationships, exploitation and voyeurism of victims, monopolization of power and influence, dominance of territory. These are things that all apply to criminal organizations, but we need to be very careful and candid that they don't apply to ourselves as well. It's really important that we share solutions and we don't covet them. It's really important that we together seek to address the structural co-factors, particularly in terms of policy and the way that that truly influences the structurally violent environments. And it's really important that we question ourselves and we make sure that we don't actually mirror the industry that we seek to prevent. And within that, it's really important that we think about the way that we're funded. It's really important the way that we think about the structure of prevention that actually is actually implemented for long enough to be able to create a genuine change. That we don't make false associations or early claims of success that are completely unrealistic. At the same time, we don't create buzzwords that then attach to funding, which then people link to, rather than actually the genuine issue that's actually within the community. We need to move away from having our own preconceived idea as to what we think the problem is. We need to listen more to communities and engage with them more to actually be able to have a truly relevant and culturally credible approach. There are many approaches around the world which have a huge amount of credibility, and there's a huge amount of evidence out there. But I think there's been a failure until recently with the formation of AIUs to be able to truly pull all of this together. And where is the representation of the UK and some of these global efforts? I just don't see it. Although there's some involvement from some really key figures from around the country that we're all aware of, I think it's something we could do more as organisations to be able to be partnered with. And with that, we need to be able to move towards more investment into primary prevention. It always seems relatively intangible, but it's really the key. And we need to think about these structurally violent environments. So there's 3 things I think are really key from our work and from that I've been involved with. We need to work together, not apart. Every interaction is an intervention, and we need to make every encounter count. It's really responsibility of us all. And I think that from time to time, it feels like this problem's insurmountable, but actually the collective effort of all of us, even if it's so small, collectively makes a massive difference, particularly for those who need us the most. Thank you.
Duncan, thank you so much. We could have listened to you for probably an hour or so. We might even give you your own webinar when you are not in your scrubs and at risk of being pulled away. So thank you so much. Lib, thank you. You don't know it, but you've positioned one of the questions that we want to pick up a little bit later in the Q&A session, the panel session. Mentioning questions, I make an assumption because so many of us have been doing this for so long now that people know how to use Zoom. But before I hand over to Brent, can I just point out to people that if you hover at the bottom of your screen, you will see there's a Q&A session, and we are leaving some time later for questions and answers to the panel that hopefully will continue to include Duncan, unless he gets drawn away, and Lib and our colleagues, both from here in the UK and from overseas. But I'm absolutely overjoyed that I'm being able to hand over now to Brent Decker, the Chief Programme Officer of Cure Violence Global. I was chatting away to him earlier like he was my friend, and then realised we'd never met, but I'd seen him speak so often. He feels like somebody I know. So thank you very much, Brent, for giving up your time today. I'm going to leave this with you for about 25-30 minutes now and sit back.
Well, thank you so much, Sherry. And thank you, Duncan, for that great kind of contextual overview. And I think that's really important in terms of the context. And so thank you for that. We're going to start off our part of the conversation with a video. So Lori is going to play this video, and then we will get into the presentation.
You know, where I grew up, you saw a lot of things. Violence was all around me. At home, yeah? And at school, I'd go to the candy store and just... Even the bus was no free ride, right? I mean, around here, you see people, you're exposed to violence. You just had to expect that, wherever. The more you saw, the more it just seemed like that was the normal way for people to behave. Even me sometimes. Before I knew it, it was touching every part of my life and spreading like a disease. Then one night, they hurt my cousin, put him in hospital. I knew what I was supposed to do, but he stopped me. He said he was an interrupter. He knew me from the neighborhood. He told me how violence can spread like a disease if you let it, and how we all end up hurt if you do. And taught me that I could help stop the violence by not being violent myself. He showed me how I could use my influence to change how the people around me viewed violence. I started to step up too. It changed who I looked up to and who looked up to me. It's all about healing the damage from the violence I've seen. It's about changing my behavior. Now, instead of adding to that violence around me, I was helping others to leave violence behind. Then they changed the people around them, across the city, across the country, across the whole world too. Because the truth is, violence is a disease, and that this is the cure. Let's make the cure contagious.
So that was a video. This I think kind of briefly goes over some of the ideas and how the program's implemented, which we'll go into further detail right now. But Cure Violence Global was founded by a physician, an epidemiologist who is working at the World Health Organization for many years, primarily in HIV/AIDS work and some tuberculosis. And when he came back to the US in the mid to late 90s, really from the perspective of the World Health Organization, and saw a huge increase in violence in many of the cities across the country, him and a number of other physicians really started to look at violence from the lens of health and what did it mean to think about violence in these terms, not only in terms of understanding it, but in terms of policy, in terms of programming, who the central actors needed to be to work on this issue. And so you can see from our perspective, obviously the idea of health is impossible when violence is present. Lori, if you could go to the next slide, please. And so what our founder and a number of other physicians, and it was mentioned in the previous presentation about violence being a contagious disease, right? Meaning it's causing more of itself a contagion. And if you treat violence like an epidemic, you can get results in the community, at the community level, and in some instances, a city level. And so when we think about violence as an epidemic, it's not just like to say it. And I think, unfortunately, there are sometimes negative connotations around some of the medical language that I agree needs to be addressed. It also has to do with some of our own stigmas around health and things of that nature. But when we think about violence and the definition of an epidemic, like we saw in the previous presentation, what we see is violent clusters like a disease. And for many reasons, I think were outlined previously. But when we see in terms of cholera, this is a picture of cholera in Bangladesh. If you look on the top left-hand side, and you can see there's kind of a clustering effect across the country. Violence too clusters. This is a picture of my beautiful city, Chicago. And so you see kind of this like clustering effect of violence. So it's not uniformly across a city or country. That violence too spreads like a disease and kind of mimics and has the same kind of epidemic wave patterns as things like the flu. We've seen recently with COVID, where there's a couple of events and we can see really sharp increases that might go down, that come up again. And so it follows kind of epidemic waves, other patterns of epidemics. And I think the main thing is that it's transmitted through exposure, modeling, social learning, and norms. And this is very different in terms of thinking about violence as a health issue or as a contagion. Is we're not saying that it is spread by bad people that need to be punished. We're not even saying like bad decisions that need to be punished. We really think about that there's a mode of transmission. So Lori, if you can go to the next slide. And in the cases of cholera and things of that nature where I'm ingesting something, violence is transmitted mainly through observing, witnessing, and the experience of trauma that I think also was discussed during the first presentation. And this really changes, in fact, how we as a human being, once we've been exposed, how we then interact with the world and make our own decisions around responding to conflicts, issues in our own life. And it spreads. So if you go to the next slide, Lori. So sometimes there are in that book that was presented earlier, The Contagion of Violence, there are some very detailed brain maps of how this process takes place. I tend to prefer this one, as antiquated as it is, but I think it really demonstrates the contagious nature really of all behavior, and violence being one of those. And so we see the boss yelling at the employee yelling at their significant other, the significant other yelling at the kid, and then the kid yelling at the poor cat, right? And so this, I think, just as antiquated as it is, I think very much demonstrates the contagious nature of all behavior and violence specifically. So if you go to the next slide, Lori. And when we think about behavior, and again, moving away from kind of bad people, but we think about violence as behavior, we know how it's formed. It's formed through modeling and trial and error. And once it's set in place, it's maintained through culture and social norms. And so what we see in this picture, which is a bit innocuous, a young kid following two adults, mostly a unconscious process, starts to copy their behavior, what they see, kind of what they are exposed to in their environment. If you go to the next slide, Lori, we see the same process happening with a very different result in terms of copying, emulating, and then the culture norms kind of cementing these as behaviors that are normalized. You go to the next slide. And what we see in many of the communities that there are a lot of methods of exposure. And so this is given the context, given some of the structural violence, take that a level down, we see in the community, sometimes there's group and gang violence, interpersonal violence, there could be civil war, media plays a role in terms of exposure, family, which we talked about earlier as well, in the school. And then also state-sanctioned violence, right? And so police violence and the institutional violence that was described earlier, right? And these all then can affect the individual and lead to more violent events once the person's been exposed, their way of behaving changes, and the kind of norms around the use of violence become changed and then cemented. And so if you go to the next slide, Lori. And what we see in many of the communities that we work in and are from, there's just kind of this constant cycle of multiple exposures leading to multiple events, leading to multiple exposures, leading to multiple events. And the result, Lori, if you can go to the next slide, please. You know, what we see across the world, just in terms of different events occurring, following very similar patterns, though, in terms of how the violence spreads. And if you go to the next slide, Lori, when we think about the social determinants of health, you know, in terms of not only the structural stuff, but violence has effects on education, it has effects on economic conditions, it has effects on the healthcare system, it has effects on the environment, community resources, community cohesion, and violence itself leads to more violence. And so we see that this violence has a very special role in terms of thinking about some of the social determinants of health and this idea of exposure and how that filters through almost every other sector when it is present as acutely as it is in many of the communities that we work in. If you go to the next slide, so the kind of the key elements in understanding the health or public health approach is this idea of understanding and not blaming, basing our policy and practice on science and research, being neutral in terms of our disposition, and like was mentioned before, like really the use of a team approach, and ensuring that kind of all parties, all stakeholders, all individuals that both are affected or are involved in violence are actually the center and the main actors of doing the violence prevention, right? This is a critical step in all public health and all public health interventions in terms of who are the main actors and how are they supported, how are resources then devoted, you know, under different policies, et cetera. But these are kind of the key elements of the health approach. And we can go to the next slide, and then I'm going to hand it off to Lori. But essentially, you know, from a health or public health lens, re-understanding violence and really moving away from moralism, right? Which was really, you know, the pictures that were shared earlier with the and the media, and you can see, I mean, just tons of moralism put into this. We're thinking about moving away from bad people, bad choices. We want to really move more towards adverse circumstances, the idea of transmission, and move towards science, again, to guide our policy, our practice, and the direct implementation. And so with that, I will pass it on to Lori to talk us through the next few slides.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lori Tiscano. I'm the Senior Director for Program Innovation at Cure Violence. And kind of where Brent ended is where I'm going to pick up. So thinking about the science of violence, but now thinking about how other diseases are eradicated. So thinking about the World Health Organization's methodology to stop cholera, to stop the spread of COVID, you know, that starts with interrupting the transmission, preventing future spread, and changing group norms. And so when we think about the specific work that we're doing, that methodology is flipped to look like this. So Michael Davis, who is now on camera as well, one of my colleagues and I are going to kind of go into a deeper dive of the Cure Violence model itself. And so looking at the methodology and thinking of it a bit differently, in our work, interrupting the transmission means mediating conflicts. It means keeping conflicts cool so that they don't erupt into violence. And then if violence does occur, preventing retaliations. When we talk about reducing the risk for people that are at highest risk for involvement in violence, it's being able to identify those individuals, assess individuals to determine if they're highest risk, work to change their behaviors, and then provide that long-term treatment. And then in changing community norms, a lot of the work that we're doing, specifically in the US and in Latin America as well, and some other places, you know, the main form of violence is shootings, but really we're talking about responding to any incident of violence. So if violence erupts, what does a response look like? How do we as a community come together to say that this isn't normal and we want to see this change within our specific communities? So that takes organizing the community, and that also is spreading positive norms. And so these are things that we're doing every single day in terms of replicating the model. Every site uses the same methodology. The way that we tackle violence is using that same World Health Organization approach in a different way. And so Mikey is going to help me a bit, and we'll dive a little deeper into specifically what interrupting the transmission looks like to start. So Mikey, I will pass it to you.
Definitely. Thank you, Lori, and thank you, Brent, for setting this up and getting everything flowing. Good morning and good evening to everyone else. So when we think about interrupting the transmission, you know, you have to be capable of being believed and trusted to actually intervene and engage with the highest potential transmitters that we tend to work with. And when we think about what those highest potential transmitters look like and the highest risk, we think about individuals who are recently released from prison, who are recent victims of violence, or they had a history of violence. They also could be weapons carriers. They are engaged in high-risk street activity. You know, it could be a variation of a few different things, but we work in interrupting that transmission to reframe and educate to stop the process of negativity from processing. You know, so making sure that individuals don't continue to carry on the acts that they were previously engaged in, and actually substitute those things with new understandings and new behaviors, whether that's something to distract them, or those new thoughts, but you have to have that credibility. You have to be able to be suitable in that particular community to actually reach those potential transmitters. Hit it, Lord. So when we think about change behaviors, you know, in this piece for me, again, Lori just talked about that long-term treatment, you know, and me coming into this field as one of the youngest individuals to ever be on the VI OW side at 18 years old, I came into this work as an outreach worker. And for me, when I think about change behaviors and how behaviors are changed, you know, it's through preventing that future spread and constantly reforming the thinking of that highest risk individual that you're working with by equipping them with the new information and the new skills that they need to avoid these certain situations that's created from these new behaviors, you know. So our OWs do work with these individuals to get them to understand not only potential, but also, you know, I mean, things that they can avoid because of their relationships and because of their leaderships in those particular communities, and how violent, and going right into the next piece, Laura, you can hit it for norm change. And then going right into the next piece and working with that, not just that participant, but also with that community on norm change. You know, with this one right here, particularly for me, it's straight to the point. You know, violence is not normal. In the community that I've come from, in multiple communities, I mean, not multiple, but every community that we've been able to implement in and that we work in, you know, violence has become normalized in these communities. You know, an individual is shot, an individual is stabbed, an individual is beaten, domestic violence. What these things are coming about in these communities, where other individuals in that community are starting to turn their heads to it because it's become a norm in these neighborhoods. So understanding that physical force is intended to hurt, damage, or kill, you know what I mean, and responding to shootings and mediating these conflicts actually help us change the way that people look and see our violence interrupters and our credible best messengers in these communities. Again, myself as an example, you know, I used to be doing all of these devious things in my community, but once I converted over to actually be an outreach worker in a violence interrupter, and I changed the norm. My presence was the first norm change for that particular community, because I was always known for stirring up that community and bringing negativity to it. And now that I was doing things in a positive manner, the community got to see me in a positive light. So I was the addition of that first norm change in my particular community. You can hit it, Lord. And then on this last piece, you know, changing norms and what we do with our public education, you know, we saturate these communities with these different messages. You know, when we talk about the different messages, we always make sure that we speak to multiple audiences, and we understand that every audience requires a different message, you know. So when we think about these audiences may be the program participants and their peers who's either perpetrators or are affected by the violence directly. You have the general population, and you also have other CV communities. So we always critique and form our public education to match and to interpret what's going on in that particular community, so we can be better effective in the way that we actually reach out to our partners and that we continue to build partnerships in this form of changing norms.
Yeah, and if I can add, so we're going to do a deeper dive into the elements of the model tomorrow as well. And so this is kind of just like this, you know, this brief overview. I think in terms of the public education messaging, you know, we've seen a lot of power with this. When you think about public health and reaching multiple audiences. So we have outreach workers and violence interrupters and the teams themselves that are working with those at highest risk, right? But then we have all of these other partners in the space within a neighborhood. You know, this is something that's completely community-led, community-driven. And so the messaging comes from the community, but it's this idea that the different messages resonate with different groups, right? And so part of the thinking, you know, when you think about behavior change, and when you think about how many times, you know, if you're going through a behavior change process, you know, it may take you 7 tries going through all of those steps of a behavior change process until you stop smoking, let's say, or until you commit to eating healthy. But with that behavior change is this idea that you're getting this information from multiple people in different ways. So these types of messages are present within a community, are, you know, from the clergy to residents to the teams themselves. And it's the idea of using this and the work of the teams with those at highest risk to get to that tipping point to where we actually see the change happening. And I can kick this one off, Mikey. I would say we could probably spend the next day, 2 days, 3 days talking about using data and the purpose of data and the importance of data. But what I will say, and we'll dive into this a little bit more in tomorrow's webinar, every single thing that we do is data driven in this work, from where the intervention is targeting, you know, from communities that are disproportionately affected by the form of violence we're trying to interrupt, right? Figuring out what those communities are, where those communities are, to what hours those events are happening, you know, what specific blocks, if we're going to canvas as a team to kind of gather information and connect with those at highest risk. Where are we going? When are we going? Why are we going? You know, it's using the data to improve efficiency and effectiveness. You know, one of the things that we really are proud of in the past few years is the development of a database where all of the work is captured. And what that database also does is it allows us to see what's working and what isn't. So one of the things that we focus a lot on are conflict mediation. So if there's a conflict between 2 groups within a community, and we know that a particular strategy has been effective, well, then we want to be using that strategy every time a conflict arises between these 2 groups. So we're thinking about efficiency in that space. You know, if there's 9 different mediation techniques and this one always works, well, let's stick with that one. And so it's about using all of the information from the knowledge of our staff to part 1 violent crime, to what happened in this specific community 2 weeks ago, a month ago, a year ago. But all of that is figuring out how to best do this work and how to have the biggest impact. Not sure, Mikey or Brent, if you want to add anything on this piece. I know we love this part the most.
Yeah, you hit that perfectly on the head, Lori.
And really the thinking of this is all of these inputs, you know, the trained staff, the risk reduction work with those at highest risk, the mediations that are conducted, the pub ed that's disseminated, the community events that are held, you know, all of these activities are what gets us to that final result of reduced violence and norm change within neighborhoods. So this slide is just kind of showing you where we've been, where we are. So we have both partners in the United States as well as internationally. Some of these projects have been ongoing for years. Some are new, some are past, some are groups that are exploring partnerships, but really thinking about how you take the methodology and adapt it to fit the local context. And that's what these groups have specifically done. So violence in New York may look a little bit different from violence in London or violence in Honduras, right? But using that same methodology and using the science of violence gets results. And so that's why we're continuing to see partnership throughout the world. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into results now. Again, this is, I think that there's some slides tomorrow too that are very specific about each individual evaluation, but we just kind of wanted to give you a highlight. So thinking about, being evidence-based, being independently evaluated, all of the work that we're doing, we want to learn from what works. We want to learn from what doesn't work. I think that those of us on this call or this webinar could also spend hours talking to you about the mistakes that we've made and the things that we've learned, and using those lessons to improve the work and be innovative in this space. So just to give you kind of a look at what we've seen. So these are some results from the programs internationally. We're going to dive a little bit deeper, but I'll let you take a look at this now. I will say a lot of the sites that we're working in, when we're thinking about results, it really is a reduction in that form of violence. We are starting to look more at the behavior change pieces. I think there's some deeper dives that we're looking to do specifically around the results of reduced exposure. And so how that benefits communities and children specifically as they grow and mature. So some of the findings, so the Baltimore project is actually a project that I ran for 7 years and left that project in 2014 to come on board with Cure Violence Global. And that continues, but you'll see, one of the specific things that we were looking at were reductions in shootings and killings. Several of those sites now have gone a year without a shooting, which was unthinkable historically, but now is becoming the norm. Same thing in Chicago, really looking at reductions in shootings and killings, and also looking at the reduction in retaliatory killings as well. In Puerto Rico, same thing, reductions in shootings, or I'm sorry, reductions in killings. In New York, same thing. But then we look at it a little bit in a few different ways, right? So this was a big piece that especially, when I was working in Baltimore, it was also, are we changing norms around this? We have interrupters, violence interrupters who are credible messengers, who are from the communities that they're working in, who are trusted, who have the rapport, who have the knowledge. But are we simply just interrupting an incident, or are we shifting the behavior of those at highest risk so that they themselves would no longer engage in violent behavior? And part of our evaluation looked at that and found that that individuals that were in the communities we were working in were 4 times more likely to show little or no support for using a gun, using that level of violence to settle a dispute. So I think that's a really big piece of the puzzle, is that behavior change piece. Same thing looking in Chicago, program participants. So individuals who historically may have had challenges in traditional social services efforts, who may be disconnected from those efforts, who those efforts might not be targeting, they might not be culturally appropriate, they might not be something that works for them, identifying that the outreach workers that they were working with daily in this program were the individuals that they could most trust aside from their immediate family. So I think that also that also shows specifically about how much the people that do this work matter to the people that they serve.
Definitely.
Did you want to chime in, Mikey?
Yeah, so, me personally, in this particular piece right here, the Auburn Gresham, because this is this that I come to, and it plays right back into the last statistic. Me personally, getting engaged with the work and being a participant before coming aboard on the team, it was the outreach worker who was actually able to kind of break the barriers for me to really get an understanding of what I was doing in my community because of the relationship that I had and the reputation of that particular outreach worker. So we did see a decrease in a lot of shootings in the Auburn Gresham community once the program was implemented. And it did come from a lot of variations of just having the right workers and knowing what right places to hit and being able to identify these hot spots to actually get in tune with the individuals who were the perpetrators and the drivers of violence in this particular community.
Yeah, and what this one showed, you can see from the pictures, this was all about making hot spots cool.
Yes.
You can see that here as well. So originally, I'm circling my mouse. You probably can't see it. So the red of the hotspot becoming cool with the green blues. We are doing a lot of work in New York City right now. There are, I think it's up to like 30 sites throughout
Yes.
boroughs of New York. And this was looking at comparisons between communities that had the intervention and another that did not. And so you can see the difference in terms of reduction. So cure violence in East New York, 50% reduction as compared to another area in Flatbush, Queens that did not have the intervention. Duncan mentioned our work in South Africa briefly. This was the same kind of thing. When we first started thinking about replication outside of the US, it really is about that adaptation to local context. And that's really been a big piece of the puzzle. So violence may look similar, in terms of the weapons that's used, or it may look different in terms of the weapons that are used, but really the methodology is what continues to work throughout the world. And so we were able to see those same types of results in Cape Town, South Africa as well. Another more evidence of that is our project in Honduras. So again, specifically looking at reductions in shootings. I'm not sure if it's in the chat, but when we send out a copy of this, we'll also send out a link to all of these evaluations so that you can do a deeper dive or check out some more information. This was looking at the program in Trinidad, so you can see when the project was launched in terms of then reducing shootings and killings. One of the things that were we weren't looking at this. So this was about increased confidence in the police, specifically in New York. This was a finding of their evaluation that it wasn't something that we were looking into, but it is something else that came out of this project. And I think that speaks primarily to social cohesion, to the changes in communities. And so that's another piece of the puzzle as well in terms of seeing positive outcomes. I think I'm probably short on time. I said I wasn't really good with time, so I'm going to try and speed through a couple of these. In looking at the big picture about the cost of violence, we know that violence is costing cities and countries throughout the world a staggering amount. And that's even just in looking at hospital expenses, government expenses, incarceration, that's not even taking into consideration what violence does to individuals, what violence does to families, loss of productivity, loss of life, the trauma involved. And so we'll dive deeper into this tomorrow, but I think it's worth taking a look at. And then my project here in Baltimore, the evaluation had found that over the course of 3 years, that we could definitely say that the program reduced 5.4 homicides, averted 34.6 shootings. So looking at the average medical and lost productivity cost for that time, which was 1.3 million, looking at the cost of the project, which was 500,000 US dollars per site, and there were 4 sites, you can see that doing this work not only saves lives, it saves funds as well. So I think there's some power in thinking about it that way.
Laurie, I'm just cutting across you 2 more minutes and I need you, if you don't mind, to wrap up.
I'm close, Sherry, I'm so close. And we'll dive deeper into this tomorrow as well. But, even in looking at the report that came out in terms of the London costs of violence, which would be specifically knife crime, and the recommendations that came out of that report also lead us to thinking about violence in a different way, how using health approaches saves lives, saves dollars, and actually does work. I'm gonna go real quick through this one and then I'm gonna wrap it up. Here in the US, there is a larger movement to really change the way that we view and treat violence. So it's this movement towards violence as a health issue. There are 400 individuals from 100 organizations currently working on this. These are the goals of that project. And really what we're thinking about is, what are ways in which the stakeholders and key partners can be using the health lens in the way that they work, right? So thinking about primary care, educating and screening and referring for all forms of violence, and then using that data for interventions. And ultimately it's getting to this framework, this larger health system to prevent violence. So how do all of these key groups and individuals and partners, how do we use the health lens to better inform our work, to better help those disproportionately affected, and to change the way that we as the world reduce violence and view violence differently? And there we go. And I will pause there.
Thank you so much, Laurie, Mikey and Brent. That was just fascinating. And we could listen to you for hours, but we've got some great questions. If I can ask everybody now who's on the panel to stick their microphones on and their cameras on. Hoping we've still got Duncan with us. Yes, we have. We've got my colleague Jason from London, from Safer London, joining us alongside Jackie Bolton, our director of Garden, and everybody that you've already heard from. We've got some really fascinating questions, but I'm going to kick off, and I know you've touched on this, but I thought it would be interesting perhaps to hear Jason's opinion on this, as well as colleagues from the US. And I think it was the question that Lib positioned right at the beginning there, that can we be sure that moving something from the US to the UK can work because of the different context? So I don't know, Brent, Laurie, if you want to kick off, or Mikey.
I can start. I think for us, we've seen that it can, in terms of being able to adopt kind of epidemic control to different contexts. But I think the critical piece is working closely with local stakeholders and community-based partners to really fine-tune and adapt not only the approaches, but the specific techniques around mediation, specifically some of the language on some of the pub ed, and specifically about how to do different types of events that can really kind of support community to change some of the behaviors and norms around violence. And so I think, we've seen this happen in South Africa, we've seen this happen in Central America, in the Caribbean, that we've seen it be able to be effective. I think there are broader issues in terms of some of the structural stuff that is, very different in Honduras than it is in Baltimore. But in terms of really thinking about this at a community level and empowering local community actors to be kind of resourced and supported to do this, we've been able to see it have reductions in a lot of different parts of the world.
Jason, I don't know if you've got anything, something you and I have had a conversation about, and I wondered if you wanted to come back on that question.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. Thank you. First of all, good evening or good morning, wherever you are. I tend to hear this question all the while. Can we bring something like that over here, or will it work here, or is that ideal for London? And people ask my input, and what I would say is similar to anything else and any other approach that's worldwide, and any other issue that's worldwide. In the beginning, that was touched upon was the label of it being a disease. I do get that language can be harmful, but my thing is to overlook all of the language, all of the barriers, all of the issues that would stop something like this from working. And I would say let's give it a try. Yeah. We look around the world and we look across the world for all kind of approaches to all kind of issues, and some work and some don't work in the UK. Similarly, right now we're all looking at this new vaccine for the pandemic that's hitting us today called COVID-19. Does Pfizer work? Does it work? Does the one that President Trump say works? Does this one work? I'm not sure. Everyone's got their concerns. Some people say they'll take it live on TV, some people won't. We all agree that violence is happening worldwide. It's happening with young people in London. It's happening with young people in all of the places that Michael, Laurie, and Brent discussed. So will it work? I don't know, but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to listen. I'm willing to do something about the issue that we have today. And I'm open for any kind of approach. And like any other approach, they have the evidence, and we here deliver evidence-based approaches and interventions to young people. So I'm willing to look at their evidence and see if it works and give it a try, because everyone's sitting here, I believe, on out there. I can't see you. I'm from my home. I'm just looking at myself on a screen. But I believe everybody there all has this empathetic nature towards helping young people and stopping the violence. So if you're wondering if it can work or not work, just give it a try, yeah? And see if it works, and then move on to the next one if it doesn't work. That's what I would say, yeah? That's my opinion.
Brilliant, thank you. Anyone else on the panel want to come back on that before we move on to some of the other questions? No, right.
Can I say something?
Yeah, of course you can. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think it's about bringing global methodology and then applying it to the very local context. And to do that, you need to have the right data, which means you have to ask the right questions. And even if you're asking the wrong questions, you need to have the patience to be able to listen out for the answers that you weren't expecting, and then to dive deep into that data and to look at the local community and see what is really the issue. And it's not about transplanting, I think, just an automatic solution that's been applied in one city. It's about taking the methodology, the systematic data collection, and the way of then bringing that all together and then applying to the very local context with the cultural credibility it needs, not to just get the engagement, but to actually to be able to deliver solutions on a community level. And that's the thing. And the difficulty, I think, with the data that we've had in the past is that we've used different terms and different points of reference. And there's something about synchronizing that language and synchronizing those terms that not only guides the better use of the resources that we have, but it also means that we can compare and look at other things that have happened around the world to actually to be able to draw some real comparisons. Because at the moment, the goalposts are all in different places.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for that, Duncan. I'm going to ask one other question that is always fired at me, and I'm going to ask Mikey and maybe Jason to very briefly talk to this, because I know it's the subject of our webinar, the third webinar, which will be on Thursday. And that is, people quite often say it's quite clear that people like Mikey and the colleagues that do this incredible work are so special and so different that how will we find those credible messengers? Can we even find people like that in London? I know I've got my opinion. Mikey, Jason, thoughts?
So first I'll say yes. I mean, Jason is obviously one of those individuals sitting right here at the table with us in London, as well as every other individual is. I think that we are credible in our own right, and we all contribute to what this approach actually looks like in our particular communities. But yes, we can find credible messengers. We found credible messengers. You know, the time me and Laurie actually came to London, you know, I had the privilege to go into the community with Hashi Muhammad, and not only is he a phenomenal and hands down a credible messenger in his particular community, but he took me to communities where I was able to engage with some of the highest potential transmitters that can actually be the individuals who are leading this work and who can actually work on the ground with the particular individuals who are drivers of violence and who are experiencing constant, you know, how can I say this without sounding super street, but they have the reputations needed in their respected communities to get an individual to put their weapons down or to halt to the situation is worked on a little bit more. So the question about credible messengers in London, I think is beyond any, there's credible messengers in every community. And the beautiful thing about London at current is we've actually been able to identify some of those credible messengers and what that actually looks like in the communities that we look to implement here.
Brilliant, thanks Mikey, and that'll be discussed more on that third webinar, won't it? Jason, do you want to just add to this, because you and I were speaking at a conference last week and we got pretty much asked this same question then, didn't we?
Yeah, credibility, it goes with, as Mikey said, there's a lot of credible messengers out there, and I believe that possibly everybody sitting there would be a credible messenger. Anybody that can deliver an outcome is credible. Anybody that delivers what they say they're going to do, trust, is credible. It's about the values that you have. If you're empathetic about working with young people and young people listen to you, then you're credible. Yeah, and those that are credible can find other credible people. Yeah, it's about locality. It's about the area that we're talking about. Go into those areas. Those of you that are working in those areas, you would be able to identify who's credible in that area. So yes, I would say that credible messages are very easy to find, because I'm not listening to nobody unless they're credible, if I'm honest with you.
Brilliant, thanks Jason. Right, I'm going to start moving on to some of the questions that have been put in the Q&A box lower down. We've got some amazing questions and I do want to get responses to them. We've got about 15 minutes left and I don't know if we will get them all covered off, but what we will promise to do is share the recording of this webinar and get answers to all of those questions posted both on our website. I think Cure Violence are going to put a link on their website, and I don't know if the VRU want to, but they're more than welcome to if they want. I'm going to ask the first question. The very first question that came in was actually to you, Duncan, and it said, thank you, Duncan. What advice can you provide to practitioners on the topic of cultural competence, unconscious bias, and understanding of trauma, in brackets, violence? Are you okay to pick that up, and then maybe others might want to chip in?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's everything. I think, as we said, we have to be engaged with our communities, but we have to be in partnership with them in terms of seeking solutions. We have to be able to address the key issues, and this is the nub of it. In terms of evidence, I mean, there's a huge amount of evidence from the Cure Violence work, from the Wraparound Project in San Francisco, from a lot of the work that came out of that Contagion of Violence report, but also locally within London, the Therapeutic Intervention for Peace report that the Power of the Fight group with Ben Lindsay done just recently, and I'll attach a link to it in the chat, you know, is a really brilliant piece of work which really gets to these key issues. And we can't just be tacit in acceptance of the issues that we're facing. We have to address them, and we have to address the reality of it, and particularly institutional racism within society and within the structure of social policy. And we have to get to grips with it. We can't just stand on the sidelines and just see it continue like the way that it is. And the way that that then is factionalized by people, and people maintain those polarized positions because it, to some degree, it sometimes justifies their own existence. We have to move away from that and come together to be able to address the genuine issues that young people are facing on the streets. And it's inextricably linked with the assumptions that we make about the problem that we perceive that people have, rather than actually listening and to find what their real problem is. And as we've seen time and time again with the images in social media and what we've been talking about, the way that young people in particular are labelled, I think we have to be very, very careful about that. And as practitioners, we have to try and not be prejudiced ourselves in our assumptions that are made in so many different ways about young people and people who've come in who may be perpetrators or they may be victims, and they're often both. And we have to see them in the same and try and treat them and move on. It's a really important thing. I just draw your attention to that recent report from the Power of the Fight group. I think it's brilliant.
Brilliant. Thank you, Duncan. Anybody else want to come back on cultural competence?
I mean, only Sherry, really, to, if it's okay, to just endorse an awful lot of what Duncan's just said there. And there's a kind of theme that is running through, isn't it? Even the questions and how we're answering them. You know, that are there, you know, people in London who can play the same role as, you know, has been played elsewhere? Absolutely. There are absolutely stacks of different people all across London who are working every single day to combat violence in a very different way. How they're working with, and of course some of them are, you know, young people, is very much around that consistent, trusted relationship. And how we can, I think, as institutions or organisations sort of support that is very much by putting the primacy of the community and the experience of those individuals at the forefront of the way we frame our work. And that takes kind of a mind adjustment, but it's a really, really important one. Rather than us developing the program and imposing it, it's got to be about trying to nurture the different programs that are already existing, working out the ingredients that work, funding and supporting them. So it's kind of, it's changing, I think, sometimes the very established way of doing things that will enable that community voice to be more than just a voice, but to be a really sustainable part and a collaborative part of tackling violence. So I agree with many of the threads that have come up in the last answers to the last 3 points.
Brilliant. Thank you, Liv. There's a really long question on the Q&A session that speaks so much to many of the things that are really important to me, but it's almost 3 or 4 questions, and I'm going to ask us if we could perhaps get the views of some of our colleagues from America on the last part of that question. I think you can all see all of the question, but the last bit here is around whether or not, it says, is there a risk that this depoliticizes their, and the previous bit of the question talks about young people's, their violence which may be entirely rational and a logical response to the unjust conditions that they're living within. And I think for me, so often that resonates with me because I see the actions of some of the young people that we work with at Safer London as completely logical within the context in which they operate, yet naturally we do not want them to be victims of violence or hurt in any way themselves. But I think that's a really interesting question. I wondered if Brent or Laurie, whether or not you've got some response to that. And I think Mikey spoke to it a little bit, so I wonder if Mikey's got a view as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the issue of violence and is super complicated. And I think when we think about the violence that we're talking about, it's really about violence that happens within a community from one community member to another. And so I think that's kind of the main focus of our thing. In terms of depoliticizing it, I mean, I think it's an excellent question and something that needs to be thought through. I mean, I think in public health, many times, you know, our practice is kind of dealing with the reality of the world as it is, and you know, different agencies and different institutions have different levels of comfortability in terms of addressing some of the structural stuff. But I'll say this: I don't think Cure Violence Global sees this as like the solution, right? We're really thinking about how do we prevent violent events today. In terms of the context, in terms of addressing some of the structural issues, there are much stronger, smarter, more intelligent voices on that issue. And so I think, and even Duncan's presentation, I was really glad to hear a lot of those issues addressed. I think we see it really about preventing violent events that's happening between community members today. And then how that feeds into a broader strategy, I think, is important. And we, as individuals and an organization, support a lot of those larger things and movements and conversations about that. But we have a very, I think, some would say limited, but we think a very specific role in terms of preventing events today. And Mikey and Laurie, please chime in if I've misrepresented anything. But I think those are the important questions. And you know, we do have had some partnerships in Palestine, right, in the West Bank. And again, there's a big context there. The focus of our work has really been about some of the communal violence that's been taking place, and that's kind of what we see our role in terms of the broader addressing some of those issues. Obviously, there's, you know, larger institutions and groups dealing with that.
Yeah, and I think that's really helpful, Brent. When we were sharing some of the promotion around these events tonight, someone came back and said, you know, that actually it's about the structural issues, etc., etc. And I responded in almost the exact same way as you did, is that I absolutely don't disagree with that it is about inequality and social injustice, and we need to deal with that. But in the meantime, there needs to be some interventions around violence.
The only other thing I would just add too is just like, I think it shouldn't be an either or. I mean, the structural stuff has to be addressed 100%. And you would never hear any of us say otherwise. I mean, it's just about the either or and how do we obviously complexly figure some of that out, but that doesn't always stop the violent events from happening today. So it's not an either or in our book.
Absolutely. Thank you. Unless Laurie or Mikey have got anything they want to add to that, I want to jump to one last question. I promise everybody that's made comments or questions, we'll make sure we get this up on the website. But I think many people will be really interested in this. Me in particular, there's a great question in here about where do we get the money from to do this sort of stuff. And I wish I had the answer, because then I'd be announcing that we're rolling out and working with partners to roll out Cure Violence in London. That's a whole bigger issue, but it would be really useful. There's a question here about what sort of partnerships are needed to deliver a Cure Violence intervention successfully, whether it is in somewhere like Cape Town, London or New York. Laurie, can you pick that up as a sort of final question?
Sure. I mean, I think when we're talking about partnerships, it's all of the agencies, organizations, from public health to education to law enforcement to, you know, honestly, the community as a whole. That's the biggest piece of the puzzle, is having the community lead this work, be the voice of this work, you know, define what it looks like specifically. And then how do we fund it? You know, that's always been a challenge, and it looks differently everywhere. Here in the US, you know, a lot of the sites, it's diversification of funds. So it's federal dollars plus state dollars plus city dollars plus foundation dollars. And, you know, I think that's in who holds the purse strings. I know that question said, it's really thinking about what resonates with that group. So even when we think about credible messengers, you know, how do we communicate the value of this work to people who sometimes aren't always looking at what saving a life means specifically, right? But thinking about this as also a cost-effective strategy. And I think it really does. I mean, ultimately, it comes down to the way that we shift how we view and treat violence. You know, in New York, I would say is probably the best evidence of that. I mean, this is their crisis management system using the Cure Violence model is what they do to reduce shootings and killings. I mean, that is citywide. And then in addition to that, it's building out then that larger systems response. What does it look like to address those underlying inequities? What does it look like in terms of treating trauma? What does it look like in terms of healing? And so it's getting all of those people around the table, and then to fund it, I think it's, you know, how do you get to that tipping point with having voices like, you know, all of the people that I'm sure are joining us now from all of these different areas to say, this is how we want to treat violence. You know, we have to do something differently. Suppression and enforcement is not working. We're not seeing the value add to our communities when that is our only response, right? It may be a piece of the puzzle, but there also needs to be investment in approaches like this.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm pretty much going to wrap up now. I'm going to thank everybody. Lib, thank you so much. You've been so supportive. I've been like a dog with a bone around this Cure Violence stuff ever since I've had breakfast with Charlie, as I spoke about earlier, and have pestered you for your support. And I appreciate the fact that you're still here a couple of years later. Duncan, thank you so much. As I say, I think anybody in the UK, in fact worldwide, know that health professionals right now are pretty busy people, and the fact that you've given your time this evening during this international pandemic, I can't thank you enough. Brent, Laurie, Mikey, thank you so much. I know that you're going to be with us tomorrow. We're going to go into more depth about certain things, and more importantly, there will be opportunities for people to reach out and have personalised conversations with Laurie and Mikey and other colleagues from Cure Violence about what the next steps are around this work. Jason and Jackie, thank you for your work as well in pulling this together. Anyone that isn't registered for tomorrow's webinar, you can register on our website. If you have problems, contact us at Safer London. I'd like to thank everybody and wish everybody, colleagues in America, have a good day, and people here in the UK, have a nice evening. And I look forward to speaking to many of you again tomorrow. So on that note, I'm going to say good night. Thank you.